Okay, so this is, as it turns out, the last of these timetables reach classes. So before we sort of get stuck into the topic, I just wanted to sort of talk a bit about what happens from here onwards. So the first thing is that you should, I think today or at latest at the beginning of next week, have an email from Vicky Osmond, which basically asks you whether you're still intending to be an early applicant. In other words, whether you want to continue to be part of the sort of reach thing. And it's hugely important that if you are proposing to carry on, that you fill that in and say yes, to make sure that you're still on everybody's radar for the remaining support that's to come. So if you're in the habit of ignoring those kind of emails, don't ignore that one. You need to get that form filled in and sent back to her. If you're not sure still, of course, that's fine. I mean, this doesn't commit you to anything. So if you're thinking, I might still apply for medicine, or maybe I'll go off and rear goats in the Himalayas or something, and you're not quite sure which, that's fine. Just say yes. So if there's a slightest chance that you're going to be an early applicant, then say yes and fill the form in. So that will mean various things. One thing is that what we aim to do for early applicants is to get you onto UCAS this term, so that you don't have to worry about that when you come back in September. So I think she's planning to organise some sessions, and you can just choose one that's convenient for you in computer rooms where you can go along, and there'll be somebody to help you get your account set up and point out that your name needs to have capital letters and all those kind of things that sort of make a difference on these sort of forms. So you need to find out about those, and you'll get that information, provided you sign up when she sends this thing around. The other thing that will happen is that if you're applying for medicine or dentistry, or indeed for Oxbridge Science, then I will have a one-to-one meeting with you sometime between next week and when you disappear in July. So there are a lot of people to talk to. So basically, I'll send you a suggested meeting time, and if you can't make it, we'll rearrange it. But I mean, it could be any time between sort of now and July, because there are just a lot of people to fill in. But if you happen to get a late one, but you want to have a chat about stuff earlier, then just let me know and we can find a time to do that. So don't sort of feel that you have to wait for the appointed time. If you need to have an earlier meeting, then just let me know and we can do that. But that will be essentially to talk through where you're up to, what your concerns are, what your uncertainties are, and just to make sure you know what your priorities need to be going forward. Speaking of which, then, your priority at the moment is presumably your summer exams. So remember that these are important in various ways. The first is really that you need to know whether you're more or less on track for the grades you're going to need, which are going to be A's essentially, or whether you're a long way away from there, in which case you're going to really need to worry about doing something about that. And the only way you can tell that is by doing a proper preparation job for these exams. There's no point sort of saying, oh, I can't be bothered to do any revision, so I'll get bad grades and I won't worry about it, because you need to know at this point whether you're sort of, you don't have to be absolutely on target, but you need to know that you're not a million miles away. So I think that it's right that should be your priority at the moment. The other reason for that is that by doing that preparation now, you'll feel much more confident coming back in September, thinking, okay, I've basically nailed down that first year stuff. If you're going into the second year thinking, I never really got all that stuff sorted out last year, and you've got to worry about that as well as all the new second year content, it can get a bit overwhelming. So for all those reasons, take those summer exams seriously. And hopefully that will give you the sort of grades that you need to get good grade prediction. So the way UCAS works is that they ask the college to predict what A-level grades you will get. And obviously, everybody knows that that's a highly unreliable thing. And so nobody's pretending that anybody really knows what grades you're going to get at this point. But we have to do our best. And the college can't just predict A's for everybody, because the universities, I think, give them those kind of data, and they know that they can just disregard them if we were to predict A's for everyone. So your teachers will have to try and give a reasonably realistic grade prediction. But they will err on the side of generosity. So it's not that if you fail to get an A in the summer exams, they won't predict an A for your A levels, provided they can see that you're a hard worker, that you've got the aptitude there somewhere, and it may just not have happened on the day, then they will, I'm sure, predict higher grades than you managed to get. But you don't want to be too far away. If you get a D in your summer exams and you go to your teacher and say, I need an A-star prediction because I want to go to Cambridge, they will probably laugh. You've got to be close enough that it seems like a reasonable request. Okay, so again, make sure you do the preparation for those. Some universities look at the grade predictions for medicine and dentistry and say, well, if you're not on target for A's, we won't consider your application. A lot of them these days ignore them because they know that they're not actually very valid. But you don't want to take chances with that. So try and get them as high as you can. If you have problems with the grade predictions, come and talk to me about it, and we'll see what can be done about it. But the best thing to do is do well in the summer exams, and then it won't be an issue. Okay, so that's the first priority. Next priority is going to be UCAT. Okay, so remember that UCAT is at least partly the passport to interview everywhere, and in some places it's entirely the passport to interview. And you've got to be not just above average, but you've got to try and get into that sort of top 20% or so. For some universities, you've got to try and get into the top 10%, get your interview secured. And that's going to take loads of effort. So we did some introductory lessons, but obviously all they did was show you the kinds of questions you can expect. The only way you're going to get good at them is by doing masses of practice. That's going to be the next priority once the summer exams are out of the way. I had somebody ask me this week whether it was a good idea to sort of spend money on UCAT courses. There are loads of courses that you can sign up for online. My feeling in general is no, it's not worth the money spent on those courses. But I'll say a little bit more about that. I think that the only way to get good at UCAT is just by doing loads of practice. Because as we saw when we looked at the questions, the problem is not that they're intrinsically hard. It's that you just have to do them so fast. With very few exceptions, that's the case. And the way to get fast is just practice. You get to be able to do something as if it's second nature by practicing and practicing and practicing. And that's the key. Having someone explain to you how to do questions that aren't all that difficult anyway, I think is kind of pointless. So I don't really think that spending hundreds of pounds having an individual tutor who can supposedly, tell you how to do well in UCAT is a good use of your money. Obviously, it's entirely up to you, but I really don't think it achieves very much. Also, there are just loads of people doing that for free on YouTube. You can find loads of tutorial things on there that give you sort of hot tips for getting high scores and stuff. And they just say the same kind of things that these tutors will say. So don't spend hundreds of pounds. However, it may be worth spending a little bit because you need just huge numbers of questions to have enough to practice with. And you can get quite a lot for free. So I will send around to everyone some information about what's out there so you don't have to memorize this. But basically the UCAT website itself has a lot of free questions. So it has data banks of practice questions, and it also has some full practice tests. So by the time you've worked through the data bank of past questions, you'll have improved a lot, hopefully. And I would do that first. Save the practice tests for nearer the time. There's not much point doing one at the beginning, because you'll just do badly and it will depress you and you'll think, oh, this is pointless, because you won't have had time to build up the speed yet. So save those for nearer the time, but it is worth doing them. Because apart from anything else, you need to experience the sort of drain on your energy that focusing on doing those kind of questions for 2 full hours is going to make on you. So you don't want to have that experience for the first time in the test center. So do the full tests, but save them to nearer the time. Just use individual practice questions for the moment. So you can get a load off UCAT. There's a site called Pass Medicine, which is actually going to be useful to you all the way through your training, not just at this point, because that's what they do, is they produce revision resources, and it's free. And so there are hundreds, maybe thousands of practice UCAT questions that they produce. So by the time you've gone through UCAT and Pass Medicine, you'll have got a long way. But if you feel you need more, it starts to get difficult. However, some of the paid sites will give you access to their past questions reasonably inexpensively. So for about £30 for a month's access, you can get thousands of past questions on something Medify and things like that. And that's possibly worth doing if you get to that point where you think, right, I still need more practice and I've run out of questions. But they will try to sell you the individual tuition as well. So they say, well, you could sign up for this basic £30 a month, but why not spend £800 on our Rolls-Royce package? So practice, you get good. That's all it takes. You don't need someone to tell you how to do it. Okay, so that's UCAT. Personal statement. Remember that what I'd like you to do is to try and get a first draft done during the summer. So first draft, it can be a fairly rough one. If you're not sure what to put in, not sure what to chop out, just send me what you've got and I can make suggestions. But it would be nice if you've at least got started on it and hopefully be quite close to the finished article by the time you get back in September. It's a busy time. Starting that from scratch gets quite demanding in terms of getting that done and getting all the other things you've got to do done at the beginning of the year. So if you're still waiting to have more volunteering, more experience of whatever kind, that's fine. Leave it till later in the summer, but try to get some of it done during the summer. Send me a draft and I'll send you back some comments. Then once we get to next term, so next, in the autumn, interview practice is going to be the key. You don't generally get much notice for interviews. I mean, some of them do, but often they'll just give you a couple of weeks notice for interviews. So you can't really wait until you hear whether you've got interviews to get the practice done. You need to be practicing earlier than that. So the way it will work in the autumn is everyone will get at least one practice interview. So I'll schedule one practice interview for all of you and for all the Oxbridge natural science people. And then once that's out of the way, there will probably be opportunities for you to have more than one practice interview. So a couple of people this year ended up having 3 practice interviews just because that's what they wanted. But I think everyone should have at least one, and so we'll do that in the autumn. And again, it'll be a bit like these meetings I was talking about this term, that there's so many to go through that the slot I might send you might not be till the end of November. But if you happen to get an early interview, just let me know and we can fit one in earlier. That is what we'll aim to do. And that then should be it, because you'll do a stunning interview and you'll get your offers. So that's what's left to do, but we're not going to be doing it in these formal classes. This is the last time we meet here. It probably will continue to appear on your timetable but just ignore it. Okay, there won't be classes here on. Okay, so let's just look at this question then, which is how to choose where to apply. So we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but it probably seems a bit more real now that it's nearer to the real thing. And I know some of you at least have been sort of, maybe visiting places and looking at prospectuses and things. So it's important that we talk about it again a bit. So just to remind you that when you sign up on UCAS, what it gives you the opportunity to do is to sign up for 5 courses that you'd like to apply for. But they have this weird rule that only 4 of those can be medicine or 4 can be dentistry. So you have this 5th choice to think about. And it's up to you what you do about that. Some people just leave it blank because they think, well, there's nothing else I want to do, so I'll just apply for 4. But some people take the view, well, I ought to have a backup plan because stuff happens. Possible you don't get any offers, and then you have to think, what do I do then? And some people will apply again, but some people don't want to go through all that again, have to do UCAT again, have to do all of that again, and so they think, right, I'll have a backup plan. And you also, stuff can go wrong on the day of your A levels, and you have to think, what happens if I don't get the grades? And again, potentially you can resit them, although it's then a little bit more difficult to get in. But you may not want to do that. So some people want to have a backup plan. So have a think about what you might do if things don't go well next year in terms of getting your offers that you want or getting in because of your grades. And if you think, well, okay, I'd be quite happy to do something else, you can put that down as a 5th choice. As far as your personal statement goes, you just ignore that. Okay, so if you're applying for chemistry as your 5th choice, you don't sort of say, put in a paragraph about chemistry in your personal statement, because the medical schools don't like it. They want you to sound completely committed to medicine and nothing else, or dentistry and nothing else. They don't like it if you start talking about other things. And most backup subjects, they understand what's going on. If they get a personal statement that's all about medicine, but you're applying for chemistry, they don't think this is weird. They understand why that's happened. And depending how much they like the look of you, they'll either say, well, we'll make you an offer anyway, or they may ask you to send them a separate personal statement for their subject. Okay, so think about what you might do. Sometimes people think, right, well, if I don't get in this time, I still want to be a doctor or a dentist, but I'll apply as a graduate. And that is a possible route. A lot of people do that. And a lot of people sign up to courses like biomedical science, or biochemistry, or something like that, as a sort of stepping stone to going on and doing graduate medicine. And there is a certain amount of sense in doing that, because it means that the sort of theoretical content of your medicine course, when you do finally get onto it, you'll know quite a lot of it already, so it can sort of help take the pressure off a little bit if you've done biomedical science or something. But you don't have to do that. So I know somebody who did a degree in pottery and then went on and did graduate medicine at Newcastle. So it doesn't have to be in a biomedical subject. So just have a think about what you would do with maybe your whole life, or maybe your 3 years before you apply for graduate medicine if plan A doesn't work out. Okay, so in terms of how big a choice you have for medicine, it's huge. So there are now over 40 courses that you can apply for. Much more restricted for dentistry, so it's not such a struggle to sort of narrow it down. But you've still got a bit, because you've got to choose 4 out of 14 or so. So how are you going to go about doing that? And there are lots of things you might potentially think about. So one question that lots of people ask is, well, which are the best places to go? I want to go to the top place, the place that's going to give me my best future career. And it's really difficult to answer that question in any meaningful way. There are league tables. So you may have looked at these. If you haven't, it's worth spending a little time looking at them before deciding they're pretty useless. But have a look at them. So the Complete University Guide or the Guardian, they both produce league tables. If you're applying for academic subjects, I think these can be quite useful, because you find huge variation in terms of the levels of that the students are at. So if you choose to do chemistry at Oxford, it's going to be very different from doing chemistry at Worcester, or if they even do chemistry. But you know what I mean, because it's going to be a very different bunch of students, and you'll get very different levels of student satisfaction. But what you find for medicine and for dentistry is that they don't actually vary all that much. So these tables aren't really all that useful. And in terms of the content of the course, the really important thing is that obviously what all these universities have to do is turn out students who are not going to kill people once they go into clinical practice. So they all have to teach to essentially the same standard. You have to leave with the same set of clinical skills that you know how to do, and pretty much the same knowledge. So it doesn't matter very much where you go, because you know that the General Medical Council monitors these things and makes sure that you're going to be turned out competent to do what you're going to do. So it's worth having a quick look at these. So I just put some extracts on here. So this is for dentistry. So these are the top ranked ones. So this is 7 out of 14. But there are a few important things to notice. The first is that they compute an overall score based on their various criteria, and you can see, looking at the top 7, that score varies hugely between 100% and 99%. In other words, they're basically all pretty much the same, and it would be completely wrong to say, oh, Queen's Belfast is rubbish compared to Dundee because it's 7th and Dundee's first, because you can see the numbers are almost the same. Also, entry standards means what's the average A-level profile for students going on to this course. And who cares? It's irrelevant. That's useful if you're applying for academic subjects, as you say, because it gives you a feeling for whether this is going to be a really ambitious course or a lower level course. But for medicine and dentistry, who cares about entry standards? Same with research quality. Okay, so if the people in the university you apply to happen to be doing world-shattering research, does that mean that you'll get better teaching? No, irrelevant at this point in your career. So you can ignore that one as well. The one that possibly is worth looking at is the student satisfaction one, because that won't tell you how good you're going to be as a doctor or dentist at the end, but it will tell you how kind of annoying it might be if they're a bit disorganized or whatever along the way. And that counts for something. And they do vary a little bit. So you can see everybody loves Dundee, 90% student satisfaction, whereas you go down to Leeds there and it's only 73%. But that's still the majority of students think it's great. So it's not like, again, you'll see if you look at tables for other subjects, sometimes that goes down to 20%. And that's when you think this is not a course I should be doing. And none of them are like that. It may be worth looking at the student satisfaction as a sort of tiebreaker if you can't decide in any other way, but it's not all that different. And if you look at the other end of the table, so those are the top 7, the other end of the table, then you can see that it's still only down to 92% for Anglia Ruskin. And the student satisfaction is actually higher at Anglia Ruskin than it was for some of those ones up at the top. So they're all pretty much the same. That's the important message. And perhaps the most important thing of all is the graduate prospects means how many of these people get a job, which means basically get a training place at the end of their medicine degree, and it's 100%. Okay, so for dentistry, for medicine, it doesn't matter where you go in terms of how good your preparation for your future career is going to be. Obviously, it's going to make a little bit of difference somewhere, but there's nothing that's very predictable. And certainly what you shouldn't do is listen to people my age who only know about the way the world used to be. It used to be that if you didn't go to one of the top London medical schools, it would be hard to get into the most prestigious institutes as a doctor later on. So they'll say, oh, you should apply to University College and stuff because they're the top places. But it doesn't work like that anymore. If the way it works in medicine is once you've done your 5 years, you go into foundation training, and places for foundation training are allocated in a national system, and they're allocated by a scheme that depends, first of all, on your choice. So you'll say, right, this is where I'd most like to go. This is my second choice, and you can put, many choices as you want down in order like that. And they have an algorithm that gives as many people, as high a choice on their list as they can. And where there are too many people applying for a particular course, they just use random allocation to decide who gets the place. So there's no advantage in having been somewhere fancy in terms of where you get on in the training program. And it's how well you do in that that is important for your future career. It's not where you went to medical school. For dentistry, it's a bit different because obviously you do have to apply for jobs at the end of it. But again, the evidence is that dentists are not particularly elitist. There aren't sort of elite dental schools in the same way that they used to be elite medical schools. So again, it really doesn't make much difference. There's no evidence from the employability statistics that you'll have better chances one place than another. So the important message is don't worry about where's best, because there's no easy way to answer that question, and they're all very similar. One way of just one final thing. These are the alternative tables. These are the ones in the Guardian. This is medicine one. And the interesting thing is just that they rate Aberdeen as being the absolute best place. The CUG tables, it was 19th, which just goes to show that you slightly change the criteria you look at, and it massively changes what you think is best. So don't spend a lot of time looking at these tables. You can ask the question, well, okay, is it really true that things like student satisfaction doesn't relate to how well you'll go on and do later on? And people have tried to do proper studies on these things. So this is quite old. This is from about 2019, I think. And somebody looked at the correlation between student satisfaction, which is along the bottom, and the function up the side is some sort of, it's like a kind of pass rate in professional exams later on in your career. So after you've graduated as a doctor, but when you're moving on to the next stage, you have to do professional exams like MRCP and MRCS. And this was looking at pass rates in those. And you can see there's just no correlation between student satisfaction. So back then, Liverpool seemed to have much lower satisfaction than almost everywhere else, but that didn't correlate with people who went to Liverpool doing less well in their subsequent career. And you might notice Oxford and Cambridge seem to have much greater success in later professional exams than everywhere else. But that's because the people that go to Oxford and Cambridge are good at passing exams. That was true when they applied there in the first place, and it's still going to be true later on. So again, it doesn't tell you that they had a better medical education. It just tells you that people who are good at passing exams are more likely to get into Oxford. So the reassuring thing about that is, again, that it doesn't suggest that it really matters where you go. And that was another paper that was a bit more recent. This was 2022, where they looked at MRCS. So this is people who are wanting to train to be surgeons, and looking at how well they did in their professional exams compared to where they went to medical school. And you can see it doesn't vary all that much. Once you take those error bars into account, there's very little difference between the top end and the bottom end in terms of success rate. Because what actually matters is, how hard you work, not where you do the work. So again, the evidence suggests it doesn't really. One thing you can look at is how the course is delivered. So it's not now asking, is it a good or a bad course, but it's just, is it delivered in a different way? And there are important differences here. The only really huge difference is between Oxbridge and everywhere else. This is irrelevant for dentistry because neither Oxford nor Cambridge does dentistry, but for medicine, this is a big difference. So if you go to Oxford or Cambridge, you basically get 3 years where you have very little patient contact. Very little. So it's essentially like an academic degree for 3 years. And then you do all the clinical stuff afterwards. Whereas at most other places, they start the clinical stuff much earlier. That does not mean you do less clinical stuff if you go to Oxford or Cambridge. It just means it's organised differently, so you do it all later. And the General Medical Council says Oxford and Cambridge are rubbish for doing that, but the real data suggests that that's not true. So if you want to do it that way, you don't come out as being a less good doctor. I used to teach medical students in Cambridge, and most of the ones that I still know anything about have had really good careers. Nobody's ever said to them, "Oh, you're a poor doctor because you went to Cambridge." So don't believe any of that stuff. But you have to want to have that structure of wanting to do lots and lots and lots of science to start with before you get stuck in with the patients. If you don't want to do that, then don't go there. It's not going to improve your career chances. It's just if you really love the science, you're going to get more of it by going to Oxford or Cambridge. Everywhere else does what they call an integrated structure, and all of the dental schools do this as well. So what that means is that basically you start learning clinical skills right from the beginning, alongside the theoretical stuff. So in a sense, all the other medical schools, all the dental schools are the same from that point of view, but the way they organize that varies a lot. Trouble is, it's quite difficult from where you're sat at the moment to know what's going to work better for you. So you can read the prospectuses, you can go on open days, and by all means, sort of say, I like the fact that some universities have very few lectures, so it's much more sort of self-directed learning, whereas others still have a fair proportion of traditional lectures. And you can decide, I think I'm going to really enjoy lectures, or I'm going to hate lectures, and that may help you decide. But realistically, you can't know till you get there. That's the trouble with these things. So by all means, look at the differences, but I don't think there's any evidence that says, ones that do problem-based learning end up turning out better doctors. There's no evidence that suggests that that's the case. So it's a case of what you're likely to enjoy, not what's going to make the difference to your future career prospects. So I'm not going to go into that in huge detail because, as I say, it's just a sort of personal thing. But it is worth being aware that they do things in very different ways. One of my kids went to Plymouth to do medicine because they were very keen at that point on problem-based learning, and he was very excited about that, and so that was why he applied there. And then that was the bit that he hated once he got there, because it wasn't quite what he expected. So that's the trouble. Don't rely too much on what it sounds like, because until you do it, you're not really going to know what you'll enjoy and what you don't. So, league tables don't help much. Thinking about the structure of the course doesn't help all that much, I don't think. You should think about the city where the university is, and particularly if you have other sort of interests, like kind of sporting interests and stuff, what the opportunities are for those and stuff, because you're going to be there for 5 years, 6 years potentially. So it does matter whether it's somewhere that you think you'd like to live. And when you go for interview, they will quite commonly ask you, why did you apply here? And they like you to talk about the city, not just about the course. So that's absolutely something to consider. But for most people, really, the question is that one, because it doesn't matter for your career prospects, because it's hard to know what the differences in the courses really mean. That's the one question which you can really focus on for most people. Now, if you have fantastic GCSEs and you get fantastic UCAT score, then you don't have to worry about that because you can apply pretty much anywhere. Still doesn't guarantee that you get in, because you have to be good at the interview. Everybody has to be good at that as well. But at least in terms of securing an interview, if you've got all 8s and 9s in GCSEs and you get, top decile UCAT, you can apply anywhere and be confident of getting interviews. But that's not most people. So for most of you, you have to be careful because they aren't all the same in terms of your chances of getting an interview. So you need to know what their selection methods are and play to your strengths. Choose the right ones. So these numbers in terms of how many people are applying, it's not worth dwelling on them too much. I'm not sure how precise these are, but roughly speaking, there are more than 3 people applying for every place that's available in medicine. And it's more like 4 people applying for every place in dentistry, so it's harder to get into dentistry, but it's in the same sort of ballpark. So it's important that that tells you that you can't just walk into one of these courses. It's, most people nationally are going to be disappointed each time because of those numbers. It's also important to say that if you look at the Hereford Sixth Form College numbers, they're much better than that. So in medicine, for example, we had 23 people applied last year and 19 of them got at least one offer. 15 applied this year and 13 got at least one offer. So that's because we make you do lots of preparation, basically, and we help you apply to the sensible places. So those are scarier numbers than they need be, because so long as you do the right things, your chances are much better than those numbers make it look. But you've got to take them seriously and think, if I don't do that preparation, then it's going to be tough. Look at an individual university, it's quite difficult. Most universities are quite cagey about releasing these statistics. Manchester happens to be particularly open about it. So you can see that how many people apply for each offer they made. And you can see for dentistry, those numbers are quite high. So in 2022, it was 11 people for each offer, which is kind of scary. But it has dropped a bit. So 2024, it was only 7 people applying for each offer. That is quite a lot higher than it is for medicine, as you can see. The numbers applying, the number of applications per offer for medicine have been dropping everywhere, but they've dropped particularly at Manchester for whatever reason. So last year, it was almost a 2-to-1 ratio, which is really much better than it's ever been. But even so, we've still got to be better than an awful lot of people. So the picture is getting a bit brighter. It's not as hard to get into these things as it was 2 years ago, but it is still not easy. Right, let's talk a little bit about some specific places you've got to be careful of. You have to be very careful about applying to Scottish universities, because for medicine, because they're subsidised by the Scottish government says, well, we want you to have this proportion of students being actually resident in Scotland. So you can see that those data from Edinburgh show you that it's much, much tougher to get in as an English student than as a Scottish one. So 3.3 applicants for every place for English students, but only 1.4 applicants for every place for Scottish students. Much tougher for English students. And you can see how they do that, looking at the way they use UCAT. The mean was only around the 3/4 point in that distribution. So, you probably had to be in the top 30% or so to get an interview if you were Scottish, but you had to be in the top 5% if you were. And even if you get to the interview stage, again, you can see almost every Scottish student who was interviewed was given an offer, but only about 2/3 of the English ones. So they make it tough at the Scottish universities. Edinburgh is worse than the others. Not impossible at the others, pretty much impossible at Edinburgh, unless you have particular circumstances, particular contextual factors. Otherwise, I would not go anywhere near it. But somebody got an offer from Glasgow this year, so it is possible to get the next Scottish one. But you do make your life more difficult. But dentistry in general, they're much less transparent about everything in dentistry in terms of admission statistics. But I did find that only 14 out of 67 people who started doing dentistry in Glasgow in that year were not Scottish. And if you look at the numbers who applied, it's difficult to know, but for medicine, it's roughly equal English and Scottish numbers applying to Scottish universities. So assuming that's true for dentistry as well, you can see again there's quite a strong preference for Scottish students. So my advice is don't apply for Scottish universities unless you have a really strong reason to do so, and definitely don't apply for more than one. It's a high risk thing. Right. As far as Wales goes, Cardiff are very open about the fact that they want to have a good proportion of people who live in Wales amongst their students. So they have a system which makes it much easier to get an interview if you're a Welsh applicant. And you can see that's reflected in the applications to offers ratio there. So it's, you know, around sort of 3 to 4 times more difficult to get into Cardiff as an English student than as a Welsh one. So if you live in Wales, apply to Cardiff. It's a very good bet. If you don't, then don't apply there unless you've got essentially perfect GCSEs, because that's what will get you into the interview stage. But otherwise, just don't apply there. There's plenty of other good places. Why take the chance? Bangor is the other Welsh one. They're too new to know really what their preferences are. But based on our statistics, since they've been up and running, 3 people from here have applied there and none of them have got in. So that may suggest that Bangor's not a good bet either, but that's obviously small numbers. Okay, so how are you going to approach this decision? Before you get into any of all the stuff we've been talking about, you've got to make sure that the places you apply to aren't just going to throw your application straight in the bin. So you have to look at their minimum requirements. So GCSEs, again, we talked about this at the beginning, so hopefully you've thought about this, but if you haven't, you need to check that your GCSEs that you've got match their minimum criteria. So some of them will say you need to have like at least 7 grade 7s, but some of them aren't nearly as tough as that. Some of them will say you have to have, you know, at least a 6 in English and maths, whereas others, again, don't care about those things. So you need to look at what you've got and check that it ticks the boxes. And it may be, again, if you've got all 8s and 9s, you don't have to worry, but for most people, you need to be careful about that. As far as your A-level subjects go, if you're doing chemistry and biology, you're pretty much fine everywhere, except for Oxford and Cambridge, where your 3rd one should be maths or science. For everywhere else, they don't care what your 3rd one is. But if you don't have chemistry or you don't have biology, then you have to be much more careful, because it's a much more restricted list of places that will accept you, so you need to look carefully at their requirements. As far as what volunteering and work experiences you've done is concerned, as we said, when we talked about those over the last 2 or 3 weeks, they are hugely important in terms of preparing you to do well at interview. But for medicine, they don't any longer judge you on how much you've done. So you don't have to declare, you know, how many weeks, how many hours you've done when you're applying for medicine. So it doesn't sort of come in hugely at the application stage. The only one to be aware of is Keele, which, although they don't count the hours, they do give you a score which is mainly based on how what you say about your volunteering and so on in your personal statement. So if you're not very strong on that side of things, Keele is probably one to avoid. But for everywhere else, it's only really at the interview stage that matters. For dentistry, that's different. For dentistry, they do have specific. Some of them have specific work experience requirements. So Newcastle is the worst, where I think they're required to have had 3 weeks with a dentist. Everywhere else it's 1 or 2 weeks, or some don't have a specific requirement at all anymore. But again, depending how much you've got, you may need to factor that in deciding where to go. So look carefully at their requirements. Once you've passed the minimum requirements, you then have to worry what kind of scoring systems do they have to decide who gets interviewed. And they vary enormously. So Cardiff, Belfast are at one extreme. They look mainly at your GCSE score. And so you need to have, say, unless you're a Welsh student for Cardiff, otherwise you need to have pretty much all 8s and 9s. Belfast, you need pretty much all 9s to get there. They have a small UCAT component that's dominated by GCSE. The other end of the spectrum, quite a lot of places, Bristol, Plymouth, quite a few others, just look at UCAT. So long as you've got the minimum requirements, they then ignore your GCSE. So somebody with 9.9 will have the same possibility as somebody who's got, a mixture of 6s and 7s, provided you've got the minimum requirements. So again, that is important to know if your GCSEs are a bit mixed. But then there's a whole load in the middle who have a complicated scoring system, which will give you some credit for how well you've done in UCAT and some credit for how well you've done in your GCSEs. So for these kind of places, it's not enough to have met their minimum requirement. That's what people get confused by sometimes. They say, oh, we require a minimum of 5 7s, and they think, great, I've got that. But then if they also score you based on what grades you've got, then it becomes more important to have higher grades. And they have complicated algorithms. These are just 2 examples. It shows you the different GCSE scoring, but they also have different weightings of how much that's mixed in with UCAT and so on. So it's quite difficult to analyze this for loads of universities. So what we do is I will send you at some point before you break up for the summer an Excel template. And the idea is once you've done your UCAT, if you can fill that in, so it will have all your GCSE results that you can put on there, plus your scores in the different UCAT tests. And it also has some questions about contextual factors and things. And then if you send that back to me, I can crunch those numbers and come up with my suggestions for what look like good bets and what look like places you should absolutely avoid. And of course, it's up to you whether you take notice of them. But my experience is that people who apply to places that I've said are very bad bets usually don't get interviews. It's more difficult to say what are good bets. So, there's still going to be some uncertainty there. But I think that's quite reassuring if you get my opinion to add to yours, essentially. So I'll send that out to you, and if you can send it back to me as soon as you've done your UCAT, and then I can help you make choices. It's been very successful, that scheme. When I first started this job, I looked at the data and saw that a lot of people who didn't get offers, it was just because they'd applied to the places that weren't sensible for them. And that doesn't happen much anymore. And I think that's probably the biggest reason why our numbers are much better than the national numbers. For dentistry, it's harder because they're much less transparent. They tend to say helpful things like, we have a holistic method for selecting who we interview. You think, oh, well, that sounds nice and lovely, but actually that doesn't help me decide whether I'm going to be a good candidate for you. So again, I'll do my best, but it is a little bit harder with dentistry to know. It's also worth thinking about the fact that although we've always sort of said, oh, you're going to need 3 A's, it isn't quite as simple as that. Because increasingly some places are starting to look for A stars. Cambridge being the extreme one, where they will tend to look for 2 or even sometimes, depending on the college, 3 A stars at A level. But a lot of other universities will ask for 1, and that started in dentistry as well, where the London ones will now ask for 1 A star. So by the time you've done your summer exams, you obviously can't really know what you're going to get at the end, but you probably have a reasonable idea whether an A star is likely to be a stretch too far for you. And if it is, you really don't want to go through the gutting process of, you know, flying there, doing a great interview, getting an offer, and then not getting there because you don't get your A star at A level, because they will usually insist on it. It's not like you'll hear for lots of subjects where they say, well, you know, they asked me for all these A stars, but actually I got 3 Bs and they let me in anyway. That does not happen in medicine and dentistry. They will usually insist on what they actually ask for. So if you feel there's a reasonable chance of getting an A star, then, you know, apply to some of those places. But if you think that's going to be a stretch for you, there are enough other places that you could apply. So why not do that? Very few places offer below that unless you have contextual factors. So the Kenton Medway is the only one whose standard offer is AAB. Bristol, though, because we're a contextual college from their point of view, their offer is also actually AAB if you apply, if you get an offer from them. So again, if you have one subject that's really a bit dodgy, looking at would I be a good fit for them in terms of their selection criteria, that might be worth considering. And well, as you know, UCAT is a huge deal. So as we've talked about a lot, you're going to have to do lots of preparations. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Final thing on this bit is that most universities have some kind of widening participation programs. So what this means is that for medicine and dentistry, they're aware of the fact that, you know, traditionally, you know, it tends to be, you know, relatively privileged middle class people that predominate on these courses, and they've tried to broaden that out a little bit by using all kinds of different approaches to try and bring a wider range of people in. And it varies enormously between universities as to how they do this. But it is worth having a look at what their widening participation criteria are, because it can make a huge difference. Some universities, it makes it more likely that you get an interview if you meet their widening participation criteria, but then it's a level playing field once you get to interview. At other places, it makes no difference to your chances of getting an interview, but you might get a lower offer at the end. So again, you know, it varies a lot, but it is worth finding out about them. So the sort of things they look at, so they vary a lot between different places. But things like if you're the first in your family to go to university, that can count sometimes. If you know you've had sort of financial hardships, they tend to look at things like have you had free school meals and stuff. That can count. If you've spent more than 3 months in care, then almost certainly you'll get interviews at places because that's a very strong widening participation criterion. But otherwise, they try to look at things like you know what your postcode is. So there's a national database that correlates your postcode with what the probability is of someone living in that postcode going to university. And if that's a low probability for you, that can be a widening participation criterion. They also look at where you did your GCSEs, and if it's a school that doesn't have the best record of achievement at GCSE, but yours are good, then again, that can count. So there are lots of different things. But if you think you may qualify on the basis of any of those kind of things, have a look at the widening participation stuff, because it can make a very big difference to your chances of interview. Okay, so